One machine that I've grown really fond of is the Commodore 128D, whether it's the plastic case version or the metal case DCR. These are just a really handy machine to have. You've got a built-in power supply, you've got Commodore 64 mode, there's a nice pizza box shape so you can just slap a monitor on top, and you've got a built-in 1571 disk drive. But having that built-in disk drive can also be a hindrance in the modern day. These are coded to device 8, and Commodore didn't provide any switches on the outside of the case to easily change that. If you pair this with an SD to IC or a Pi 1541, you're going to have some device ID conflicts. Now, you could change the external device to be device 9 or something like that, but a lot of software was coded to run on device 8, which means if you try and load something from, say, device 9, 10, 11, whatever, you may run into a loading issue. The other problem with these is they're slow as shit in Commodore 64 mode. They basically work like a 1541. And those two things are what stops me using one of these over just pulling out a Commodore 64. But there are some options to fix this. One of them is a no-cut mod. These are boards designed by Retro Ninja, and they sit under the 6522 and listen for certain commands being sent to the disk drive in order to change the device ID. He also has a similar project that can swap between the regular kernel and JiffyDOS. Those are probably your best bet if you want to do a no-cut mod. But being as these machines are fairly old, they're not in perfect condition, they're not going to be in a museum anytime soon, I'm thinking we kick this one old school. So what I have are some EEPROMs, some switches, and of course one of these. Yes, we're going to be doing the thing that I usually frown upon and try and avoid doing myself. We're going to drill some holes in these bad boys. But don't worry, I'm not just going to mount random switches in the front of the case or something. I will actually put them somewhere where they're not visible 99% of the time, and they're also not going to get in the way of anything else. So let's start off with the metal case DCR version. Now I've chosen the metal case one to begin with because it is a lot easier to mod one of these, and it'll give us an idea of what we need to do when it comes to the plastic case model, and potentially you could apply some of this to the 128 flat. Obviously not the drive switching part, but the JiffyDOS part. Anyway, let's open up the metal case one, see what we need to do. So here we are on the inside, and yes, I have already added some heat sinks to some of the ICs that get quite toasty. I've also put in one of my RF modulator replacements and run the chroma and luma signals directly from the VIC-2E over to the RF replacement. This is probably a good idea, especially for the 128 DCR, as it helps clean up some of those jail bars. It doesn't totally get rid of them, but it'll help. Anyway, that's not the subject of today's video. We're going to be looking at these two ROMs up here and a jumper and another ROM hidden under this disk drive. So let's pop this thing out of the way. All right, with the disk drive out of the way, we now have easier access to these two jumpers here and also our disk drive ROM. So let's pop this thing out. It's pretty simple because it's already in a socket. And we're also going to pop out this ROM at U32. So what we have is the Commodore 1571 disk drive ROM. This is pretty simple. We just replace that with the JiffyDOS version. And this one contains the kernels for the 64 and 128 modes. So we need to replace this with a ROM that has those kernels plus the JiffyDOS versions of those. And just to make things even a little bit more complicated, this also contains the Commodore 64 basic ROM. So we need to include that somewhere in there as well. Sounds like fun? Don't worry, it's pretty simple. So what we'll need is a 27C256 EEPROM to replace the disk drive ROM, a 27C512 to replace the other ROMs, obviously a couple of switches, a 4.7K resistor, and of course something to burn those EEPROMs with. Oh, and a little bit of wire. Okay, on the computer we want to head over to zimmers.net, look in the C128 ROM files and find the one that matches this IC. So if we search for 318023-02, there it is right there. So we'll download that. We also want to have a look in the C64 ROM files and find the basic ROM, which should be 901226-01. Grab that as well. Finally, we need to get JiffyDOS. Now, JiffyDOS is still sold under license, so you do need to purchase a license for this. In this case, we're going to grab the 128 DCR ROM set. If you're doing this on the plastic case 128D, then you want to grab the 128D ROM set, but we'll go back to the 128 plastic case in a minute. Let's grab the DCR version for now. Now, I did already buy the JiffyDOS versions yesterday, so I've already got them here. Let's open up the DCR set, and we're going to grab JiffyDOS C64 and the JiffyDOS 128 DCR, and I'm just going to stick them in a new folder over here. We'll ignore this 1571 stuff for now. We'll come back to that in a minute. And we're going to move basic and our complete copy of this ROM over into that folder as well. So we should have a bunch of files that looks just like this. The next thing we need to do is open up our programmer software. In this case, I'm using the Mini Pro, so that's going to be XG Pro. We're going to change this to a 27C512. That will do. I'll turn off the check ID because these chips are from AliExpress, so they're probably not original, but they do seem to have the right capacity. So pop 27C512 in the programmer, and we're going to load in our ROM files. Now there is a specific order that these need to go in, so you want to make sure you get that right, otherwise it's not going to work. So first up, we're going to load in our 318023 ROM. Then we're going to go back to load and load in our basic ROM 901226. But before you hit OK, you want to change the buffer start address to 8000. This is going to place that basic ROM after all the information from this IC. You also want to make sure you change this clear buffer to disable, otherwise it's going to remove everything. Load that in. So we should now see information in the buffer all the way up to 8000. So the next thing we need to do is load in our JiffyDOS ROMs. First up, we need the JiffyDOS C64 ROM, and we're going to load this into 8000. Be sure to disable the clear buffer option. And then we should see information all the way up to C1000. So once again, we're going to load, and we're going to put our 128 JiffyDOS at address C1000 and disable this. And that should be our ROM complete, so it should look full all the way up to the end here. You can also do this in Windows with the copy/B command and combine all those binary files into one file and just load that in, but it's easy enough to do it in the Mini Pro as long as you make sure you disable that buffer and load everything in at the right address. With all that looking good, we can now program our 27C512. Cool, that is all good. We're not going to put this in the 128 just yet. We still need to do a little modification to it. So let's grab the 256 EEPROM, which is going to replace our drive ROM. So we'll change this to 27C256. I'll disable that check ID. We're then going to head back into the JiffyDOS zip file and grab our 1571 ROM image. Now, there is a PAL and an NTSC version. I don't know what the difference is, but seeing as this is a PAL machine, I guess I'll use that one. Let's throw that in its own folder. There we go, and then we just need to program this to our EEPROM. No need to worry about adding any extra files to this one. We're just going to hit program and we should be good to go. If this EEPROM was blank, let me find another one. That's what happens when you get EEPROMs from AliExpress. Let's try this one. Right, and that should be our EEPROMs ready to go. So the disk drive one can go straight in the machine. Just make sure you get the notch around the right way. All the notches on these are at the front of the machine, so I need to put it up this a ways. You can put some tape over that window if you want. Now the other ROM needs to have a little modification. What we need to do is bend out pin 1. I'll try and bend it so it's as flat as possible, like that. Maybe like that. Next, we're going to take our 4.7K resistor and solder this between pin 1 and pin 28. So I'm going to place it on top of the IC and just sort of bend these legs into shape. And you should end up with something like this. So this leg can still fit in the socket on the board, and the other leg is bent straight out with not too much of this resistor leg covering the pin itself. We can now pop this in our socket at U32, again making sure we've got the notch up the right way. Of course, you want to make sure that this leg isn't touching the IC next to it. I might actually bend that up just a little bit more, hopefully without breaking the pin off. Something like that might be a little bit better. Before we worry about the switches and wiring, let's just give this a quick test. I think it should boot up into JiffyDOS straight away. All right, I've got a keyboard hooked up. I'm not going to worry about the disk drive just yet. We just want to make sure this thing boots. And we are straight into JiffyDOS, which is what we want to see. That means our 4.7K resistor that we put on is working correctly. This is just pulling up one of the address lines on this EEPROM. If we connect this pin to ground, that should boot us into our regular Commodore ROMs, which is what our switch is going to handle. So let's just double check that the disk drive ROM is working. So I can just do an @ and yes, it's saying JiffyDOS. So that's our JiffyDOS ROM for the disk drive there. That all looks good. We can check out Commodore 64 mode while we're at it. And there we are, JiffyDOS in 64 mode. Let's just quickly connect this pin to ground. Just use a little alligator clip. And we have the regular Commodore ROM. If we go 64, we should have regular Commodore Basic. Yep, cool. All right, our little modification is working so far. Now we need to put in some switches and do a little bit of wiring. Okay, before we put in the switches, we should probably sort out this drive select. So there's two jumpers here just next to this 6522 and our drive ROM. What we want to do is cut the link between the first jumper, so the one that's closest to the front of the case. We'll just double check that, make sure it's severed. Yep, cool, no connection there. So now our internal drive should be set as device 9. Obviously we don't want that all the time, so that's where our switch is going to come into play. The other side of this jumper is just connected to ground. So you've got ground on this side and the other side goes to this 6522. If we put a switch in between this point up here and ground, that's going to allow us to switch between device 8 and device 9. Now, of course, the final part is mounting the switches. I've chosen to mount the switches back here. These will stick out this side of the case, so you won't actually be able to see them when you're looking down from the top of the case, but you also won't be able to see them when you're just looking at the case front on, because they're going to be all the way back here. This is also going to stay out of the way of anything else along here, and it's not going to get in the way of anything on the PCB either. So let's start drilling. Right, we have our holes, and I also managed to clip this resistor pack, so I better just test that, make sure it still works. I think it'll be fine. Yep, everything still measures as 1K, so didn't destroy it, thankfully. Alright, that's our switches mounted. Now all we need to do is wire this up. So I think this switch towards the front will be the drive select, so let's just tin this up a little bit. And I'm just using some 30 gauge wire, wrapping wire. It doesn't need to be too thick, it's just carrying some signals. I'll just try and thread this through so it doesn't get in the way of anything else. That seems pretty good, just sneaking it under a couple of components just to hold everything in place. Now we just need to solder it to this pad closest to the 6522. Okay, that's our single drive select wire. One of the other sides of the switch just needs to go to ground, and that should be it. Cool, and that just runs from one side of the switch to ground. So when our switch is connected to ground, it'll be device 8. When it's disconnected from ground, it'll be device 9. A similar thing is going to happen with the other switch. One side's going to be connected to ground, the other side is going to be connected to this pin that we lifted on the EEPROM. Okay, so our wire comes from our lifted pin all the way across the board, snaking under a few components, all the way up to our switch. And the other end can just connect to that same ground point. That should be our soldering part complete. So let's put the disk drive back in and give this thing a proper test. So powering the machine on, we boot straight into JiffyDOS. Let's see what our drive is set to. Currently set to device 8. Let's turn this off, swap these switches around. And now we're in regular Commodore Basic and the internal drive should be device 9, which it is. Cool. 64 mode should look the same as you'd expect, which it does. Let's try this out with some speed tests. So I'm going to use Action Biker to do this test. This is obviously a Commodore 64 game. There isn't a lot of Commodore 128 software available out there, so this will do. And because we have JiffyDOS, this should be pretty quick. That is it, the game is loaded. Now if we do that same test with the regular Commodore kernel, it's going to take quite a bit longer. Right, and finally it has loaded, so yeah, pretty massive speed difference there. I think this game also suffers from being one that's hard-coded to device 8. Let's just see. So it should load this part just fine. Yeah, trying to run it doesn't work because they've hard-coded it to work on device 8. Maybe we can fix that. Will that do it? Nope. Device not present error in 20. No, I broke it. I'm not rubbing, this is an 8-bit show and tell. So that is our 128 DCR complete. As you can see, the switches are not visible until you actually go looking for them, and the same is true for looking at the front of the machine. So unless you really go looking around at the back here, you're not going to see them. And I did add a couple of little slightly crooked labels, but at least I'll know what these switches are for in the future. And yeah, they're easy enough to find when you're just feeling around for them. So that's 128 DCR. What about the 128D? All right, moving on to the plastic case D. Now the upgrade for this is going to be a little bit different to the metal case version, but very similar to the 128 flat, one of these guys. The big difference here is there's no easy spot to put a switch on one of these, so I don't plan on doing a JiffyDOS mod to this one. Let's open this thing up and get started. Alright, and this is what it looks like on the inside, so plenty of RF shielding. We've also got our disk drive and our inbuilt power supply, so we need to pull all of this out. Pretty much it's remove every screw that you can see. And now we have access to the main board. What we're going to do is remove these 4 ROM ICs. We're actually going to replace these with 2 EEPROMs, so they're going to be double the size of these original ICs, and we do need to bridge some jumpers in order for the Commodore 128 to work with just 2 ROM chips as opposed to the 4. This is very similar to how the 128 metal case version works, so there's only 2 ROM ICs in that, whereas we've got 4 in this one, and obviously the 128 flat has the same board as this, so there's also 4 in that. So you could potentially do the ROM upgrade on a 128 flat as well. The benefit of this is we're also going to upgrade to the latest version of the 128 ROMs, because the original boards had some older versions that contained a couple of bugs. Nothing too major, but I guess it's nice to have the latest version. So let's pop these 4 ROM ICs out. Alright, and the jumpers we're going to bridge are J4, J6, and also J3 over here. Now there is another way of doing this where you actually run a bodge wire from J4, but there is a little workaround doing it this way where we just need to burn the ROMs in a slightly different order, and we don't have to worry about putting in a bodge wire. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm going to stop you there. This turned out to be a bad idea, and I should have gone with the bodge wire. Turns out the guide I was using as a reference for some of this might have led me a little bit astray. I'll put a link to that in the video description, but we want to put in that bodge wire. Do not bridge J4. I ended up bridging J4, getting all the way to the end of this video before realizing it caused an issue with disk drive loading, and then spent a few hours chasing my tail. So there will be some slight continuity errors in this video. I normally leave all the mistakes in and we just find out later on at the end, but for anyone using this as a guide, I didn't want you to follow the same thing I did and then at the end of the video go, oh, by the way, you need to reverse half the stuff that you just did. So yes, we need to put a bodge wire in at J4. So if you see parts further on in this video where J4 looks to be bridged, just ignore that. So what we need to do is put in a bodge wire on the right pad of J4, so the one closest to all the ports over here. and that needs to run to address line 15, which is conveniently located nearby at this via just here. Cool, so the right hand side of J4 just needs to run to this via up here, and we just bridge J6 and bridge J3. Probably should also bend these tabs back out on the RF shield because there's going to be EEPROMs in there instead, and they shouldn't need any cooling. Once again, we're going to need JiffyDOS, so this time we're going to grab the 128D ROM overlay image. If you're doing this on a Commodore 128 flat without the disk drive, you can also get just the JiffyDOS 128 kernel ROM overlay. And back over on Zimmers, we're going to grab the basic 318022-02 ROM. This is the same ROM that's used in the Commodore 128 DCR. Okay, looking in the JiffyDOS 128D zip file, we're going to grab the JiffyDOS C64 and JiffyDOS 128, and I'll just move them over into this folder. So we've got our basic Commodore 64 ROM and also the complete ROM image that we grabbed with the 128 DCR earlier, so 318023-02. And again, we're going to burn all these to a 512 kilobit EEPROM, so let's open up the programmer. We'll set this as 27C512. I'm not going to worry about selecting the right brand. I'll just turn off check ID, and we're going to load these images in just like we did last time. So the complete ROM first, and then from 8000 we're going to put that basic ROM in. Disable this. Oops. And you put 800, that would have been bad. And then from A1000 we have the JiffyDOS 64 ROM. And from C1000 we have the JiffyDOS 128 ROM. Cool, that all looks good. We can hit program. Alright, that's all done. I'm actually going to put a little bit of tape over the window on this one, more because I just want to be able to write on the top of the ROM here, because this needs to go in U32. Because we're doing JiffyDOS, it does mean that I need to bend out pin 1 on this ROM once again, so I'm just going to carefully bend that out without snapping it, hopefully. Something like that, and we're just going to solder in a 4.7K resistor from pin 1 to pin 28 again. Let's burn the other EEPROM. This is a 27C256. And we're going to load in that ROM that we downloaded, basic 318022-02. Program that. And once again, I'm just going to put a bit of tape on this, and this is going to go in U34. Now, while I've still got the Mini Pro out, we probably should burn the ROM for the 1571 as well. So we're just going to go back into our zip file and grab JiffyDOS 1571, and I'll just stick it in this folder so we can get rid of that. That was the one for the DCR. And we just need to put that on another 256 kilobit EEPROM. So I've already got 256 selected, so we can just load in the new ROM and let it clear everything, and then just program. Cool, I'll throw a bit of tape over this one just so I can write on that. I'll just put 1571. Alright, that's enough EEPROM programming. We can close all this up. Alright, so once again, we're just going to put a 4.7K resistor over U32 going from pin 1 to pin 28. Cool, that should be ready to go. So our U32 ROM is going to go in the socket for U32. What a surprise. And remember that the notches all face the front of the machine, so actually need to go up this way. And our one labeled U34 is going to go in U34. Again, making sure we get it the right way around. Last thing we need to do is just run a wire from this leg that we lifted over here to our switch. For the switches, I'm either thinking this area back here or this spot up the front. Either way, it's not going to be visible when you're looking down on the case from above, so I think that's our best bet. Probably want to avoid going around this screw hole, so maybe we'll put them up the back here. All we need to do is just remove the motherboard and a little plastic panel underneath. So there is a plastic panel at the front. If you just remove all these screws, you can actually lift that out, and that'll give you access to this area under here. but there is also a panel up the back. So let's lift out this one. Easy enough, and there's our keyboard cable. So yes, that is normally where that lives. Maybe I shouldn't put switches there, because if this bumps into them, that's not going to be such a good thing. Let's go with the panel at the front. Cool, there we go, plenty of room. There's even enough space to hide your contraband if you wanted to. So as long as I place these switches low enough on the plastic here, they're not going to stick out from the side of the case and potentially get bumped. So somewhere around there. Time for some more drilling, and thankfully it's plastic this time, so I won't have to use too much force like I did with the metal case one. I really need some new drill bits. There we go, that should do it. Now we just got to wire them up. And because this plastic piece normally sits flush, I may just cut that little tiny bit of plastic out of that corner there, just so I can route these wires through. Just like that. Okay, so I've just connected a yellow wire to the middle of this first switch. This is going to go off to our 1571 drive board, so we don't need to worry about that as long as it's got a decent amount of length. And the other side of the switch has ground connected to it, which is also connected to a side of this switch. That all just goes back to ground. Ground is ground, so we're all good there. And then the middle wire from the second switch goes across the board here and ends up at our ROM U32, just on that lifted pin. So we can now put this little panel back in and wire up the rest of the drive select switch. I'm going to attempt Murphy a little bit and reassemble pretty much the entire machine, because we've only got this one wire left and we need to get the drive back in to test that out. So hopefully I've done everything right here and I don't have to pull all these screws out again, all 30 odd of them. Okay, we're mostly reassembled. We just need to take this RF shield off so we can get access to our disk drive board. Alrighty, so this is our ROM IC, so we can pop this out because it's just in a socket. I think it is in a socket on every 1571 drive, including the ones in the 128D. Now, where did I put that EEPROM? Over here. So that should be the drive ready with JiffyDOS. Now we just need to wire up this drive select wire. So there's two jumpers on the board that say dev number on top and J1 and J2 below. We're going to cut the jumper for J1 and install this wire on the side closest to the front of the machine. So with any luck, I managed to cut this trace completely. Yep, there's 30 mega ohms between those pads, so that is cut. What I might do here is solder a little pin header into this via just here that connects to that pad, just so that you can disconnect it in case you ever need to pull the drive out of this machine. You don't have to desolder this wire, you can just unplug it. Alright, so this pin here should be connected to this pad, which it is. I just need to put a little connector on the end of our wire. Now, because this is quite thin wire, I'm just going to put a little bit of solder in there just to hold everything together. I just don't trust it to make a proper connection with such thin wire. Just like that. Not enough to get in the way of the plug itself, but enough to keep that wire secure. Alright, there we go. At least that way it can be unplugged easily should we ever need to remove this again. Is it going to fit under the RF shield? Bet you it won't. It doesn't fit under the RF shield. That's okay. We can bend it over a little bit. That's fine. Okay, so here we are, all reassembled. I even busted out the monitor for this, so let's power it on, see how we go. So we've booted straight into JiffyDOS, that's always a good sign. Let's try and load something. So it's currently trying to use that drive. Let's flick our switches around. And now we're in the regular Commodore BASIC. And device 8's not present, so this should be device 9. which it is. Now, because I'm a fan of using original discs, I don't want it to be device 9. I actually want device 8, and I don't want to wait all day, so we're going to re-enable JiffyDOS. Go 64. And that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching. If you're planning on doing this mod, let me know how you go. If you didn't enjoy this mod, if you think that drilling holes is a bit too much, well, fair enough. I actually really like using this machine, and having that drive switch and JiffyDOS there just makes it all a little bit more easy to use. So I'm actually going to enjoy using this a little bit more. Like I said at the start, these machines weren't in perfect condition, so I'm not that fussed about it. I would much rather have a machine that I enjoy using than something that just sits on the shelf. I know there's plenty of stuff back here that sits on the shelf, but I do actually use most of this. So yeah, let me know what you think. Would you do the same if you were in a similar position, or would you just leave everything untouched? Would you go all out and just put a Raspberry Pi in there? Don't do that. Let me know. Put a comment in. Thank you all for watching. A huge thanks to the people that support the channel on Patreon. And if you want to do the same, links to that are down in the video description. And be sure to like, subscribe, share it around, all that stuff. I will catch you all in the next one. It's time for my possibly, I guess, favorite game, because I always seem to go back to it. So thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Sure beats waiting about 2 or 3 minutes. Some cracked rows can be cool. Let's do this. You know what, this is normally where I'd end the video, but I think we'll just keep going. See how far I can get before being zapped. So if you're looking at the time on this video and wondering why it still goes for another 2 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, that's why. We're just gonna keep going. It's really thrown me a challenging layout this time. The layout of Impossible Mission is random every time you load it up, and yeah, this one's looking a little bit trickier than normal. A lot of angry robots. Especially the one up the top that's following me. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get past him. Well, that's the end of the video. Bye.